Friends, welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss, and today I'm so thrilled to welcome Rich Villodas to the show. Back in my old podcast, Managing Leadership Anxiety, Rich was one of the most frequent returning guests, and that's no coincidence. He's one of my favorite pastors for a number of reasons. Rich, if you're not familiar with him, pastors one of the most remarkable churches in North America, New Life Church in Queens, New York City. Listen, if you are ever in New York over a weekend, New Life is one of the great churches to go visit, see what God's doing there. I love Rich for so many reasons. One is he has been trained in the same theory that I was trained in, so I love to nerd out with Rich, that theory being systems theory. Rich is also an author, and he's written some phenomenal books. His first book, The Deeply Formed Life, still to me one of my top choices in spiritual formation. He wrote Good and Beautiful and Kind, and his most recent book, The Narrow Path, as he looks at the life of Jesus, particularly focusing on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In this episode, we get into the narrow path. We get into why is it so difficult for followers of Jesus to follow Jesus' narrow path as taught in the Sermon on the Mount. But Rich is also kind enough to engage the theme of our series right now, our false needs. We dig into what do you think you need that you don't really need and what's going on there. I think you'll really enjoy it. So as we prepare for Rich, just a moment to not invite God's presence, but recognize and relax into God's presence. Not only is God with us, but God has us. When we walk through our day today, whatever is on your mind today, whatever is on your list of things to do, whatever's in your calendar, God's already there. And so as you navigate your day, just a simple reminder that you can relax into God's presence by remembering that God is with you and God is ahead of you. Here's my chat with Rich. Rich, I've always been a bit chagrined as a preacher that Jesus didn't actually preach much, but he did give us the Sermon on the Mount. This, of course, being the focus of your new book, The Narrow Path. Why is it that he gave that sermon, a couple of thousand years ago, but still every time we read it, we're provoked? What's going on there?
Steve, I think he is getting at some of the most important aspects of what it means to be human. He is addressing what our longing is for the good life and reframing it. I think he's trying to help us live deep beneath the surface, beyond just behavioral, religious norms. And I think he's trying to connect us ultimately to a life of love. And so I think the Sermon on the Mount stands the test of time because Jesus is offering words that we long to hear as it relates to being human as well as being connected to God and one another.
And there is something, like when I say countercultural, it's like any culture is provoked by it, but I do think Western culture is particularly arrested by it. What's your take there as you dug into it?
Oh, no, 100%. I think every generation has its own particular values, idols, whatever you want to call it, that are inconsistent with the way of the kingdom of God. And so in many ways, I think there's a refrain in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And he says that multiple times. I think we need a lot of that in our own Western culture. You have heard it said, but Jesus says unto you. And I think one of those areas, for example, is how we determine what success is, how we determine what it means to be winning in life. And from the very onset of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus reframes. And I write this, Steve, as someone on the journey as well. This is not me saying I'm writing this as someone who has figured this out. I'm doing okay. I see this as a daily struggle. Am I going to say yes to Jesus's vision of the good life? Or am I going to say yes to Western cultures and the American dream's vision of the good life? And so I think his sermon not only reaches every generation, but particularly in our generation, I think it has a lot to say.
Yeah, and that whole refrain, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," it feels like it's equally provocative to religious people, or maybe even more pointedly, religious leaders, right? Like a lot of Jesus' reframing was people who really did think they were on the path for God.
Yeah, I think the religious audience is probably Jesus's primary audience in that context, which is why those who find themselves dabbling in religion, curious about Christianity, spirituality, Christians would be careful to heed his instructions and his words, because more than anything, I think he's challenging religious ideas of even, for example, what people have believed about Moses. You have heard it said, "Don't commit murder." That's a good thing, but people were setting the bar pretty low. I mean, Steve, at the end of the day, if you said to yourself, "I didn't kill anyone today," and that's not really a high bar of moral integrity. But Jesus says, "You've heard that, but I say unto you, if you're carrying a level of anger in your soul that's corrosive, you've already violated that command." And he's talking to good religious people who have memorized the Bible, people who have memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, people who would have gone to worship and prayed and all that. And so I think particular attention for those who find themselves as religious, Christian, church-going folks. I think this sermon especially is a word for us.
Yeah. And then, of course, really pointedly, anyone that opens the Bible in front of people, like you and I, people who make sense of Scripture on behalf of others, we carry this kind of power, whether we feel like we have it or not. I'm just haunted, Rich, that I think by default, I just naturally assume that I'm on God's side, or maybe even more terrifyingly, God's on my side. I notice this most particularly when I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. Part of the reason I'm on Twitter is to practice being connected, because I get so reactive.
Yes.
But it's pretty disturbing how much I'm on Twitter and I'm judging some Christian leader on there who, in my opinion, is saying something outrageous or being unnecessarily provocative. I kind of am afraid that maybe God has something for me in that. What's your take on that?
I think the way Jesus ends the sermon gets exactly to that point. It's terrifying, where in Matthew 7, as he's talking about true disciples and false disciples or prophets, and then he goes into true and false disciples, the leaders who might have been saying, "I'm doing all these things in your name. I've prophesied in your name. I've done wonderful works in your name." And Jesus says, I never knew you. Which is staggering and terrifying, that we could be doing good work in the name of Jesus and yet not have our lives ordered in such a way that reflects his values, his priorities. As a pastor, as a preacher, that gets me shaking in my Jordans. I would say shaking in my boots. I'm not wearing boots these days, but shaking in my Jordans here because of how provocative and in many ways terrifying those words are.
You do quite a job of defining a peacekeeper versus a peacemaker. I just think this would be so helpful if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Yeah, I mean, a peacekeeper is someone who, at the end of the day, is doing all that they can not to rock the boat, not to create what they might regard as an anxious system. They're trying to maintain calm, but they're doing so, you could argue, through the means of denial, through the means of deception, through the means of a false sense of peace. It's a false peace, really. Whereas a peacemaker is someone who is willing to have the hard conversation, willing to go into areas that produce a lot of anxiety, willing to expose yourself to the potential of being wounded, the potential of having conversations not go in a way that you would prefer. But ultimately, as I have said in different places, the only place where God doesn't dwell is in illusion. God only dwells in reality. And the degree to which we live in reality is the degree to which we live in truth, and vice versa. And I think a peacemaker is someone who chooses to live in truth and not denial. And ultimately, I think that's what reflects life in the kingdom of God.
Yeah, so your goal is to be a peacemaker. It's a fascinating challenge, particularly in your pastoral context. You pastor a wildly diverse congregation in Queens.
Yes, I do.
You also, just knowing you personally, Rich, you also take seriously, I think, the public role of a pastor. You're often sharing statements with us that you have made for your congregation.
Yeah.
Rich, I've always found it so helpful when you decide, okay, I'm going to actually share this. But you're also a people pleaser. You like people to like you.
100%.
I'd love to hear more about the tension of that between, peacemaking and people pleasing. That's a tough dance?
It's a very tough dance, Steve. The call to addressing particular matters in a public way it emerges out of a deep sense of calling. It's not something that I feel like drawn to do, like I want to do it. I just feel like God has entrusted me with a particular platform, whatever it might be, and to help particular people, especially, I think especially of people who are maybe giving up on faith, giving up on Christianity, who might be deconstructing, and they're looking for an alternative approach to what it means to follow Jesus. My heart, evangelistically, in many ways, goes out to those group of people. At the same time, it's very difficult because I know that to take a stand on anything, to do any good differentiation work, to take a stand is going to lead to lots of resistance, lots of opposition, people saying some hurtful things. And I think in some ways I have come a long way from the level of reactivity and fragility that I have felt in the past. But it's still there. There's still, and depending on where I'm at in a given week, in a given month, the overarching kind of ecosystem of my own life, I might still respond in ways that are not ideal. Sometimes I find myself going, that was a pretty scathing comment or direct message, and I'm okay. And then the next week, something maybe not even as scathing, and somehow I find myself, turning into myself and feeling embarrassment or shame, whatever it might be. But I think this is the ongoing wrestling that I have of trying to take a stand where I think appropriate and reflecting the gospel and the life of Jesus, and at the same time, not being overly concerned with what people think about me.
Yeah. You write in the book, I've got the quote here, "The image we have of God in our head determines the degree of worry we feel in our soul." Mm. That's a provocative idea. Huh. Tell us more about that.
It's interesting in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, first of all, he's talking about money, and then he transitions into worry, anxiety, to be anxious, look at the birds in the air, the grass in the field. And so he goes from one particular area of our lives that produces arguably the most amount of anxiety, money, financial stability, economic sustainability, and then he goes right into worry. And what's fascinating is, of course, Jesus is not working with the same kind of tools that we are today, looking at therapy and psychology and such. But he is, I think, addressing a particular area, Steve, that often goes, I think, not as unnoticed, not as much attention is paid to it, and is really our conception or perception of who God is and the connection to the worry and anxiety we feel in our soul. And that's what Jesus does. He begins to say, look at, God is providing all these things for the birds in the air, the grass in the field. Wouldn't he do more for you? And I think at the core of it, Jesus is trying to help us understand the character, the heart of the Father, but he's doing it in such a way that's helping us see the correlation. Our inability to see God in the particular light that Jesus is trying to demonstrate leads to a level of worry and concern and anxiety. That's not to say that we will always have and live with a perfect vision of God in our souls, but I do think we can be moving closer and closer so that we can live more at ease, confident in his provision and in his care and in his love.
My podcast community is familiar with my interest in a Catholic priest named Herbert McCabe.
Oh yeah, love him.
Yeah.
God, Christ in Us is a great book there.
Yeah. And then Faith Within Reason, he kicks around this idea that sin doesn't change God's view of us. Sin changes our view of God's view of us.
Yes.
When I was reading that in Narrow Path, that's what it reminded me of, is this phenomenal idea that the reason to not sin is to improve our chances of seeing God for who he really is.
Right. Which is why, which I think Brennan Manning said it in one of his books that, the primary revelation that Jesus comes to bring is what God is like.
Yeah.
and he's Abba, and he's trying to reframe, heal the distorted images of God that we have in our minds and carry in our souls. And I think that's, in many respects, the starting point to address worry and anxiety and concern.
Why is it that we can know that? We can read the Sermon on the Mount. I bet a lot of us have read or listened to the Sermon on the Mount, I bet hundreds of times for some of us. But it feels like we still need that reminder of who God is. What's going on there that we seem to default back into a God of judgment or disappointment?
Two things come to mind. One, I think, is I wonder if we don't spend enough time truly meditating and reflecting on Jesus and allowing his words, his life, his character as reflected in the Gospels, to really sit with it. In other words, not just beholding Jesus, but doing it in a way that is spacious, doing it in a way where it's slow and contemplative. And so I think so much of our inability to see it is because of the fast-paced, distracted, kind of superficial culture we live in, where, like in the parable of the different soils, the seed is sown, but it's on rocky ground, or the devil comes and snatches it away. I think so much of that soil is based upon our ability to be slow and contemplative and reflective. I think that's one. And number two, I wonder to what degree we've engaged our own stories around some of the false, maybe assumptions that we might have about God with others. To what degree are we really opening ourselves up in our stories and wrestling in community with how we view God and the impact of that? And so much of our own struggles done in isolation. I wonder to what degree honest, vulnerable community can really help us live into, this reality that Jesus calls us into.
Yeah. Yeah. Toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus kind of throws down this challenge: anyone who builds their house on the sand versus somebody who builds their house on the rock. And I think, Rich, when I was younger, I would read that and say, oh, yeah. And then I think over the years, it probably first happened for me in chaplaincy. I think the assault of death and fear showed me that my house was more on sand than maybe I realized. Had to really figure out, okay, what do I know for sure? I remember reading Annie Dillard's book, Holy the Firm. It's this kind of weird poetic theodicy book that basically what she's trying to figure out is, what can we count on? With what are we actually standing on? Anyway, I just think, man, I don't know anybody that intentionally is building their faith on sand. I don't think anyone is saying, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to build faith on shifting sand. I think the reason we get disoriented, and maybe, like, I know you have a real passion for people who deconstruct. I just wonder if they really did think it was rock, only to discover, one storm comes and the foundation's washed away. Do you have any thoughts on how to be, I don't even quite know how to ask the question, how could we know that we're actually standing on the rock of Jesus versus an assumption?
I've wrestled with that, and I do think that when Jesus, he talks about actually practicing what his teachings, I think building in new habits and rhythms and ways of ordering our lives that are anchored in what he's just taught. Chapter 7 really is the culmination of the first of chapter 5, 6, and 7. And I think the foundation that he's referring to is a life that's ordered around his particular values, principles, and imperatives. And in some ways, the Sermon on the Mount is both its inventory and invitation. I think it becomes now an opportunity to measure our lives around what God is inviting us into. To what degree is our lives oriented correctly around money? To what degree is our lives oriented? What are we doing with our anger? What are we doing with our lust? To what degree are our lives oriented around life with God in prayer? Not in such a way where this is a checklist where we do all these things and then God is happy with us. As Dale Bruner, New Testament scholar, said, Jesus begins with blessing before he commands anything,
Yeah.
which I love. Like
Yeah.
we don't get commanded into blessing. We're blessed into the commands. And so I think the degree to which we are looking at the words of Jesus, which is why I regard the Sermon on the Mount in many ways to be the most important set of teachings as it relates to faithfulness to Jesus. And what he is saying and seems to be saying in chapter 7 is the degree to which we are orienting our lives around his teachings in these particular areas is the degree to which our life will be on a strong foundation. And the degree to which our lives are not oriented around his teachings and ordered around his imperatives, that's really shallow ground and a shaky foundation we're on. And so I think it's a recalibration of why am I living the way I'm living? To what degree are these teachings truly influencing my life? Which is why, in many ways, it's beautiful and comforting at the same time. It's pretty scary because I could look at the Sermon on the Mount and go, well, look at all the ways that I'm not measuring up here. But integrity, I think, at the core is not living something faithfully, living something perfectly, but wrestling with something faithfully. And I think that's what Jesus ultimately calls us to.
Rich, we're in a series of the show where we're really just pausing and focusing on one tool to help our audience connect to God. And the tool we're really focusing on in this part of the season is the simple idea that we all have false needs and they're pesky because they feel real in the moment. You know, you and I have kicked around people pleasing. We both are prone to this. That would be a false need. And so just for the sake of our audience, I grew up in Western Australia where there's more poisonous snakes than you'll ever need to mess with. That kind of anxiety, when you see a poisonous snake coming at you, that's not a false need. That's what's clinically known as acute anxiety. And you get this big dose of adrenaline and you run for your life. And in my case, maybe you squeal like a little boy. I don't quite remember all the details. But a false need acts like that in a little momentary way. And so we're helping our listeners and our audience locate their own false needs. When you hear that, I mean, I know this is your field. You know, you're one of the few that I know that really integrates systems theory and theology for the sake of worship and formation. When you hear about false needs, what comes to mind for you?
I think one of my false needs is the need to have people speak well of me all the time.
Reputation?
Especially those who work closest to me, which is why I did a 360 last month, Steve. There were maybe 8 to 10 staff that did an evaluation on various parts of my leadership. I actually invited this, and then soon after thought this was the worst idea ever, and then got the results. The consultant who helped us printed out about an 8-page summary of all of the insights and questions. And the second time I read through it, I thought to myself, I think I need to find another job. That was my legitimate, I think I need to find another. I don't think this is, what I need to be doing with my life anymore. By the 6th time, I thought, okay, it's not too bad. But by the 2nd time reading it, and I think part of it was the false need to have my reputation, my sense of competency. So anything that came up that had any kind of connotation that I'm not competent in, the need to know stung me greatly. I mean, I can happy to go into how I was able to get through that moment there, but that's one of the needs, especially in light of just the recent month that has come to the surface.
It's fascinating to me that one of the ways that you recreationally prepare for vacation is a 360 evaluation. One thought, Rich, it might be time to schedule a proctological exam. Those tend to go
exactly.
Those tend to go well together.
Right before sabbatical, right?
When you're getting these kinds of, I've had these evaluations, and no matter how beloved and trusting it is, it's always an affront.
Yeah.
When you get these evaluations in those early readings, are you finding yourself in your mind defensive? I'm definitely projecting onto you here, Rich, but something like, look, I don't think you guys know what I'm carrying and all the things I have to deal with.
Oh yeah, that's one of my first thoughts. If you only knew what it was like to be here, then you'll know why. My mind went there very quickly. I was actually surprised how defensive. What I was, first of all, what I did was I skimmed through all the pages to try to locate all of what I would perceive as a negative comment.
The
And so I
threats,
went there
yeah.
first. And
Yeah.
I just said, okay. And I think it was my way of saying, okay, there were 10, what I would perceive as negative. When I looked at it for the sixth time, I was like, oh, these aren't a negative. These are just helpful observations. But the first couple of rounds of reading that, I went right into defensive. If you only knew, well, the reason why is because I went there very quickly.
Yeah. So these false needs, what's fascinating is we think we need them, and so then we do weird things to get them.
Mm.
So you can take the question either way. What do you do to get your false need, or what do you do when you cannot get it? So like for me, infamously coming home after a sermon, needing my wife to tell me that the Apostle Paul himself could not have preached such a fine message, and when I don't get that, I might get pouty, or
Yeah.
I start to question our relationship. It goes insane. I mean, in my head, it just becomes an insane. Does that rise up anything in you?
Yeah. For me, when I'm trying to get something, I go immediately into kind of competence mode, which I begin to overfunction. I begin to, in many ways, it's in many ways it's about not just sin avoidance. Which is, and as an Enneagram 7, pain avoidance is one of my big things there.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing everything that I can to be as competent. So I'm gonna read more. I'm gonna look at a particular field of leadership, and I'm gonna dive into particular. I'm gonna podcast. I'm gonna go to another conference. I'm gonna do everything I can not to make another mistake. Which is why one of the most liberating words that one of our elders said to me once was, Rich, especially when I took over for Pete Scazzaro, she said to me, Rich, you get to make mistakes here. And it's fascinating how quick I forget that I get to make mistakes. Not you will make mistakes. That's a definite, but you get to. And I was just really grateful for that culture of I don't have to have it all together here. Only Jesus does all things well, as one of the Gospels says about him. I don't have to. But when I'm in a bad place, I'm doing everything I can to anticipate critique and make sure I have an answer for it.
Yeah, that's really good. And then sometimes when we don't get our false need, we don't realize that it's a public experience. We think it's just inside us. And then we start to notice, like for me, with my need for my wife to adore every sermon. You know what's crazy about that, Rich? She's a preacher's kid. She went to Bible college.
She's heard everything.
She's probably listened to 10,000 sermons in her life. She does not need one more. But what I needed, or falsely needed, was her to love every single one every time. Even saying it now, it's like, this is so crazy.
Yeah.
But what really broke me was realizing the impact that my false need was having on people that deeply love me. And I found that with my staff. I like you, I had an elder pull me aside. I don't know, I've maybe been a pastor 5 or 6 years. His name was Jeff. I owe him a lot. And he said, look, I can see you want to be collaborative with us. I don't think you realize that you've thought about this thing, whatever it is you've asked us our advice on. You've probably thought about it for 50 hours. We've just come home from work. Like we're getting our church hat on. You ask this very complex situation, then you want our advice, and then you get really combative when we don't have good advice because we've just learned about it. I didn't realize that my false needs were infecting and affecting so many others. Anything come to mind for you when you've noticed, oh man, look at what I'm doing and look at how it affects good people who are good to me?
I mean, I have a very similar story, which I think some of the 360 brought that to the surface around part of my need for collaboration is me having a safe space to fall when I fail. And so if I collaborate and it doesn't go well, okay, it's us. Now, ultimately, I'm the lead pastor, but it's my kind of way of trying to soften the failure. Okay, as opposed to, um, uh, I think my personality is going to be more collaborative anyway. However, I think what the staff around me is looking for is more kind of declarative clarity, help us set the course here, but in a way that's consistent with who I am, which means I'm not going to be dictatorial. I'm not going to be combative. I'm not going to run over people, but they're looking for something more clear, something from me. I think what I've learned over the years is it's okay to have that and fail at that as well. And instead of, I'm going to get consensus all the time so that, at least in my own mind, if it doesn't go well, hey, it's all us as opposed to it's on me. And I think that's kind of the big pendulum swing as I'm in this role for now 10 years, 11 years really, that I think God's calling me to make in this particular season.
Yeah. Okay, so a final question in this kind of round where we're really looking at false needs. What we're helping people locate is where they are on the big 5 core false needs. I've been listening, so I think I know what you're going to say, but where do you relate to the need for control or perfection or having the answer, being there for others or people's approval? Most of us aren't all 5. Which ones do those kind of light you up a bit?
Yeah, I think it's having the answer and people's approval.
Yeah.
I think in some ways, this is why I enjoy social media, because on social media, it's just, there's just so much information, so many different perspectives that I can learn from and gather data and content so that I could fuel this particular need that I have. In many ways, I've mentioned that this is the challenge of social media is it helps us to makes us believe that we can take on God's attributes, that we can be all-knowing, omnipresent, and use our words for the sake of power. But for me, it's having the need to know is very deep in me, which is why one of the ways that I've tried to work against my false self in this particular area is for me to say, I don't know, or let me look that up, is a real shot to my false self. My false self really wants to know. And then connected to that is being, the approval of others. And I've connected so much of my approval to others with knowing. So if I have the answers, then, people like me, they want to follow me. If I don't have the answers, I'm disposable and discardable. And so I think that's my ongoing wrestle on a monthly basis.
It's tricky, isn't it, Rich? Because I've been doing some work lately trying to analyze, particularly for pastors, not just for pastors, but for pastors, our vocational calling. And it is fascinating to me how often God calls people whose false needs fit the pulpit. And then God redeems. Like, I think, to me, it's not all doom. Like, my preaching has benefited from my desire to know, right? I'm sure it's the same with you. Read broadly, think deeply, boil it down for something that people can digest in 30 minutes. That's like a gift from God. And yet at the same time, there's always that battle in me to be the know-it-all, the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, it is that shadow side, isn't it, of the gifts that God has given us. On the other side of that, there is some shadow to that, that if not tended to, and if we're not spending time in prayerful reflection, can really dominate and take over our lives. And now we start misusing the gifts that God has given us, or using it in a way for our own sense of ego, well-being, approval, and such. But some of the books that we write, I think, are in many ways reflections of what we most need. I love writing about prayer, and at the same time, prayer is my greatest struggle. And so I feel like I need to write on it to keep me accountable to living before God. But I think you hit it on the nose, Steve.
Yeah. Well, Rich, we've had a wonderful chat. This may end now as we move into the final round of the interview, the gauntlet of anxiety questions.
Yes.
You have amazingly stepped into the congregation of Pete Scazzero and done beautiful work yourself. You have had to do a genogram before even knowing what one was and realizing the implications
Yes.
of it. You have met Beth Moore outside the New York Knicks
Madison Square Garden, Steve. What a story that was.
to exchange tickets to watch your beloved Jalen Brunson tackle
Yes.
the
Yes.
Boston Celtics. However, you have not yet successfully endured the being human gauntlet of anxiety questions. So without further ado,
I'm ready.
all right, I think you're gonna sail through it. I'm never okay when my guests just sail through, but I'm looking at what I've chosen
All
today.
right, let's see.
I feel that you'll be all right here. Number one, what practice for you takes 5 minutes or less that really helps you connect with God?
I would say that would be journaling. I think me capturing what I'm wrestling with in a particular moment has a way of really connecting me with God.
Okay. When you think about your family of origin, what would be one asset and one liability that you've inherited?
I think without question, the asset is celebration and affection. My family does really well at celebration and joy and affection. So that'll be certainly the asset. Was there something else, Steve, you said?
Sad to say there's a liability, but you can
The
also
liability.
pass on that.
No, I'd say the liability is, by and large, I think the inability or the struggle to have honest conversations, especially through times of disagreement, has been something that I've had to work against from my family of origin.
Yeah, there is nothing like pastoring that helps you have to face that. I've
Indeed.
experienced the same thing. I think, Rich, almost every follower of Christ experiences a gap between their belief and their experience of God. So, for example, I believe God loves me, but I don't feel it. Is there a gap for you right now that you grapple with between what you believe about God versus what you experience from God?
I believe, if I can say it this way, I find that some of my greatest struggles are related to being content with who I am. And I think when God looks at me, God is, in the best sense of the word, content. Rich is right now. Rich is good. Rich is beloved. Rich, and I think there's a gap. I believe that about God, and yet I find myself striving with my own sense of discontentment.
Very good. We are both big fans of the local church. The local church, broadly in Christian circles, is undergoing quite a rough reputation. Unfortunately, a lot of that is very well earned. However, I would love to hear from you. What can you get from the local church that you cannot get anywhere else?
I do think we were able to get, and I say this with reverence and hopefully with some humility. I think we're able to get an expression of the presence of God in the church like nowhere else. I do believe that Jesus, when he says, "Where two or three are gathered, I'm there." When followers of Jesus are gathering together in that way, I think there's a unique expression of God's presence that can't be found anywhere else, and that's the beauty and gift of the local church.
All right. And then finally, a question you've been kind enough to ask on previous gauntlets with the old podcast. When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
I recently had a book launch party. My first two books happened during COVID, and so there was no parties. There was actually a virtual party for the first one, The Deeply Formed Life. And then on Facebook, like the internet went out halfway through the launch party, and I was just like, well, that was wonderful. Second one, same deal. But recently had maybe 60 friends over our home, and the outpouring of love and celebration just meant the world to me. That was a real gift.
Friends, Friends, my guest is Rich Villodas. I suspect you already know Rich, but in the off chance that you don't, Rich is the pastor at New Life Church in Queens, New York, one of the most remarkable churches in North America. I've had the great privilege of seeing Rich pastor up close and personal. I think what I can say, aside from Rich being a phenomenally thoughtful and gifted and captivating preacher, he is somebody who loves pastoring. And if you're around him, you experience that for yourself. He's written 3 phenomenal books. His first, as you just mentioned, The Deeply Formed Life, still my favorite book on spiritual formation.
Wow.
Good and Beautiful and Kind, Becoming Whole in a Fractured World. Handy book for 2024. And his most recent, also probably necessary reading to survive an election year here in North America, Rich's most recent book, The Narrow Path, How the Subversive Way of Jesus Satisfies Our Souls. Links to all of those in the show notes. Rich, thanks as always for coming on Being Human.
Steve, thanks for the kind invitation. Always a gift to be with you.